She built his empire for 12 years. He repaid her with divorce papers in front of the entire world. Victoria Bennett gave everything, her brilliance, her silence, her identity, to a man who used her mind and erased her name. On the night he was supposed to celebrate their empire together, Alessandro Romano handed her divorce papers in front of the most powerful people on earth and smiled while doing it. They took her phone, her cards, her ring, and walked her out like staff. But they forgot one thing. They couldn't take back what she already knew. If you've ever been underestimated by someone you built from nothing, hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let me see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The ballroom of the Meridian Grand had been designed to make powerful people feel even more powerful. 40-foot ceilings, chandeliers the size of small aircraft, marble floors so polished they reflected the faces of men who had spent their entire lives ensuring no one could ever look them directly in the eye. Tonight, every seat was filled. Mafia bosses seated beside senators, hedge fund managers laughing with arms dealers, international press photographers jostling against velvet ropes along the perimeter. It was the kind of room that didn't exist in any official record, and everyone in it preferred it that way. Victoria Bennett had organized every detail. She had selected the venue 14 months ago, negotiated the catering contracts, managed the guest list through 3 separate intermediaries, coordinated security rotations with the head of Alessandro's private detail, and personally reviewed the seating chart 6 times to ensure no 2 rival families ended up within visible proximity of each other. She had done all of this without a title, without credit, and without complaint because that was the arrangement, had always been the arrangement, and because she had told herself for 12 years that the work was enough, that being essential was the same as being valued. She believed that until 9:47 p.m. on a Thursday night in October, when she understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that she had been wrong about almost everything. The evening had started without incident. Victoria arrived early, as she always did, wearing a deep charcoal gown she had chosen specifically to avoid drawing attention. Structured, elegant, precise. The kind of dress that communicated competence rather than ambition. Alessandro had texted her at 6 p.m. "Wear something appropriate. Tonight is important." She had not responded because she never responded to that kind of message. She simply did what was required and did it well. He arrived at 8:30 with his inner circle, 4 men in tailored suits who moved around him like satellites, anticipating his direction, absorbing his energy, reflecting his authority back at him in ways designed to keep him comfortable. Dante Ricci, his consigliere, who had never trusted Victoria and never bothered to hide it. Marco Venn, head of financial operations, who had spent the better part of a decade taking credit for analysis he didn't understand. 2 others whose names she had stopped caring about somewhere around year 9. Alessandro looked good. He always looked good. That was one of the things she had once loved about him. The way he commanded a room simply by entering it, the ease of his confidence, the way every person in his vicinity instinctively recalibrated their own posture. He was 51 now, silver at the temples, jaw still sharp, eyes still carrying that particular quality she had once called intelligence, and had more recently begun to identify as something else. Calculation, maybe. Or performance. He caught her eye across the room and nodded once. That was all. She nodded back. Turned to confirm the evening's timeline with the event coordinator, a nervous young man named Paul who had been sweating through his jacket since 6 p.m. The speeches would begin at 9:15. The formal announcement, the 20th anniversary of the Romano organization, reframed publicly as a legitimate investment holding company, would come from Alessandro at 9:45. Victoria had written the speech herself, 3 drafts, the final version printed and placed in the inside breast pocket of Alessandro's jacket by Dante 2 hours ago. At 9:12, Dante appeared at her elbow. "He wants to see you before the speeches." She set down her glass. "The timeline, now." She followed Dante through a service corridor behind the main stage, down a short hallway that smelled of industrial cleaning fluid and fresh flowers, into a holding room used by performers and guest speakers. Alessandro was standing at a small table, loosening his cufflinks and then refastening them. A nervous habit she had catalogued years ago and never mentioned. 2 men she didn't recognize stood near the far wall. His attorney, Richard Holt was seated at the table with a leather folder open in front of him. Victoria stopped in the doorway. She had a good mind. People who knew her, the few people who actually knew her, not the version of her that existed in Alessandro's orbit, said it was her most defining characteristic. Not beautiful, not warm, not charming, though she was, at various degrees, all of those things. Her mind, the way she processed information, the speed of it, the way she could hold 30 competing variables in her head simultaneously and produce a synthesis that others only reached days later, if at all. That mind was working now, cataloging the room in under 4 seconds. The attorney, the folder, the two unknown men positioned near the exit, Alessandro not making eye contact. Her stomach dropped. She kept her face still. "Close the door," Alessandro said. She did. She stood with her back to it. "We're going to announce a few changes tonight," he said. His voice was level, almost gentle, which was worse. Alessandro was never gentle unless he was delivering something designed to cause damage. "To the organizational structure. I wasn't briefed on any structural changes." "No, you weren't." Richard Holt cleared his throat and pushed the folder forward across the table without standing. Victoria didn't move toward it. "Alessandro." She said his name the way she had learned to say it over the past several years, without inflection, without warmth, without any of the specific hope she'd once loaded into it. "Whatever this is, the middle of an anniversary gala isn't the right venue." "I disagree." He finally looked at her. "I think the venue is exactly right." She understood then. Not the details, the specifics would come, but the shape of what was happening, the architecture of it. She had spent 12 years understanding how Alessandro Romano built things, and she understood now that she was standing inside something he had constructed specifically for her. The room, the attorney, the timing. "You could have done this privately," she said. "I could have." He adjusted his cufflink again. "I chose not to." She crossed the room and looked at the folder. Divorce petition. Already filed. The papers inside were a formality. Signatures required. But the legal process had already been initiated without her knowledge, apparently weeks ago, judging by the filing date at the top of the first page. She looked up at him. "Who's the attorney?" she asked, nodding toward Holt. "Mine," Alessandro said. "I can see that. I mean, you filed this without informing me, which means either you're incompetent or you expected me to refuse to sign." She set the folder back down. "Which one is it?" Something shifted in his face, just briefly. She had surprised him, which she still occasionally managed to do despite 12 years of proximity, because he had never fully understood her. Had understood her usefulness, her capability, her function, but not the actual mechanisms of how she thought. That gap had always existed between them. She had once thought it was temporary. "Sign the papers, Victoria." "In here or in front of everyone?" He said it simply. That was always the plan. For 3 seconds, she stood completely still. The sound of the ballroom filtered through the walls, laughter, the clink of glassware, the low murmur of 300 powerful people enjoying an evening that she had assembled piece by piece over 14 months. She thought about Paul sweating through his jacket. She thought about the seating chart and the 6 revisions and the 14 months and the 12 years and the morning 3 years ago when she had been sitting in the kitchen at 4 a.m. working through a merger analysis that would save the Romano organization $11 million, and Alessandro had walked through without looking at her, poured himself a glass of water, and gone back to bed without saying a word. "All right," she said. He blinked. "All right? I'll sign." She straightened. "Let's go." She watched something that was almost disappointment move across his face before the blankness closed over it again. He had expected a scene, had planned for one, had probably rehearsed his responses to it. She had just taken that from him, and she felt, beneath the cold settling dread, a small and vicious satisfaction in it. They walked back through the service corridor together. At the door to the main stage, Alessandro paused and turned to her with an expression she had once loved and had spent years learning to read accurately. "You should have been more careful," he said, "about letting people know how much you do here." She said nothing. He walked out onto the stage. What followed lasted 11 minutes, though it felt compressed, airless, like watching something happen from the bottom of a swimming pool. Alessandro stood at the podium and delivered the first half of the speech she had written for him. Warm, authoritative, precise, and then set aside the printed pages and improvised, which he almost never did, and the improvisation was the real speech, the one he'd been constructing inside himself for months. He thanked his organization, he thanked his allies. He referenced the 20 years with a kind of practiced nostalgia that the room responded to immediately. These were people who understood the value of longevity in industries that killed most of their participants early. And then, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and never had, he said that every great empire required structural evolution, and that this evening marked not only a celebration but a transition. He gestured to Richard Holt at the edge of the stage. Holt walked to Victoria, standing at the side of the room, and presented the folder. She heard it before she understood it. A shift in the room's energy, a collective intake of breath, the specific silence that descends when powerful people recognize that something private is being made public. Cameras turned. Phones appeared despite the no photography policy. The staff wasn't stopping anyone, which meant Alessandro had already instructed them not to. She took the folder from Holt. Alessandro spoke into the microphone with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this precise moment many times. Victoria and I have reached the end of a chapter. The divorce was finalized this week. Tonight, the Romano organization moves forward. He said it like a quarterly earnings update. She opened the folder and looked at the papers. Her hands were steady. She was aware of 300 pairs of eyes, and at least 40 camera lenses, and the specific quality of Alessandro's smile as he watched her from the podium, waiting for the collapse that he had engineered this entire evening to produce publicly. Victoria signed the papers. She handed the folder back to Holt without looking at him. She walked off the stage. Dante Ricci materialized at her side before she reached the door. She had to grant him that. He was efficient, and held out his hand. "Your phone." She looked at him. "House account cards, car keys." He paused, then added, with what she recognized as genuine discomfort, "The ring." She understood that Alessandro had thought of everything. The accounts had been frozen before tonight. She would discover this when she tried her card at the coat check and the transaction was declined. The penthouse access codes had been changed. Her name had already been removed from the organizational systems. She would discover this over the following 24 hours as she tried to access files she had spent years building. She removed her wedding ring and placed it in Dante's outstretched palm without drama. Then she walked to the coat check, discovered her card was declined, retrieved her coat anyway. Paul, sweating through his jacket behind the counter, processed it as complimentary without being asked, and she made a note of that because small kindnesses were worth noting, and walked out of the Meridian Grand into October air that was sharp and cold and tasted of exhaust and distant rain. The press was already outside. 12, 15 reporters and photographers who had clearly been tipped off. Another piece of preparation she hadn't known about. Another room in the architecture Alessandro had built. "Ms. Bennett, is it true the divorce was finalized this week?" "Ms. Bennett, do you have any response to, has Mr. Romano already begun a relationship with—" She walked. She kept her face still, her pace measured, her spine straight, because she had learned 12 years ago that how you moved through a room, through any space, including the street, communicated more than any words you could choose. She did not run. She did not stop. She did not answer. She had her coat and the small bag she had carried in, out of habit, a contingency habit she had developed years ago and never examined too closely. A bag that contained her personal identification, a backup credit card connected to an account Alessandro didn't know existed because she had opened it 7 years ago with cash from a consulting fee paid directly to her by a third-party contractor she had briefly assisted without his knowledge, and $2,000 in cash. She had $2,000 and a coat, and the specific kind of silence that falls over a person when the worst thing they have been quietly preparing for finally arrives, and they discover, in the midst of it, that they are still standing. She walked 4 blocks to a drugstore, bought a prepaid phone, and sat in a plastic chair at the back of the store while it charged enough to turn on. Around her, the city moved in its ordinary rhythms. A woman arguing on the phone near the vitamin aisle, a teenager methodically reading the labels on energy drinks, a store employee mopping a slow stripe down the linoleum. Victoria looked at her reflection in the dark screen of the charging phone and did not recognize immediately the woman looking back. This happened sometimes. It had happened more frequently in the past few years. She would catch herself in a mirror or a window and see someone who had spent so long making herself invisible that invisibility had become architectural, had shaped the bones of her face, the set of her shoulders, the particular blankness that people sometimes mistook for serenity. She was not serene. She thought about the morning 3 years ago when she had been working through the merger analysis at 4 a.m. She thought about all the mornings before and after it. She thought about the 12 years of meetings she had prepared for and never attended, the 12 years of strategies she had authored and never presented, the 12 years of decisions she had made for a man who had delivered them to the world as his own with such complete confidence that she had eventually begun to wonder whether her role in any of it was as significant as she believed, or whether she had simply convinced herself of her own importance because the alternative was unbearable. She wondered that for approximately 90 seconds. And then she stopped wondering it, because she had a good mind, and her good mind did not permit her to lie to herself for extended periods. She knew what she had built. She knew because she had the internal records that Alessandro's team had never known about, copies of original analyses, time-stamped drafts, correspondence chains that documented the origin of every significant decision the Romano organization had made for over a decade. She had kept them the same way she had kept the separate bank account, not with any specific plan, but with the instinct of someone who understood, somewhere below conscious articulation, that she was living inside a structure that could be dismantled without warning. The phone had enough charge to turn on. She set up the basic functions and sat for another moment in the plastic chair. Alessandro had told his inner circle, she would learn later, that she would come crawling back within a week. He had said it with the complete certainty of someone who had never witnessed a single moment in which Victoria Bennett did not perform exactly as required. He had confused performance with submission. He had watched her absorb 12 years of erasure with apparent equanimity and concluded that equanimity was the same as acceptance. He had mistaken her patience for weakness, her discipline for dependence, her silence for a lack of options. She made herself a promise in the plastic chair at the back of the drugstore. A short promise. 3 words, spoken in her own head with a quiet precision that felt, for the first time in a long time, like the truest thing in the room. Never again. Him. Not a vow of anger. Anger was available to her, was already moving through her system in long, cold waves. But anger wasn't the organizing principle she needed right now. The promise was simpler and harder than anger. It was a structural decision, a commitment to a different architecture. She stood up, pocketed the phone, and walked to the pharmacy counter to buy a notepad and a pen. She sat back down in the plastic chair and began to write. Not a plan? Not yet. The material for a plan. She wrote down every asset she actually controlled, every contact who owed her directly rather than through Alessandro, every piece of information she possessed that had value to parties outside the Romano organization. She wrote in small, tight handwriting, nothing wasted, filling the first 6 pages of the notepad with the actual inventory of her actual life beneath the life she had been living for 12 years. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, considerably more than nothing. At 11:45 p.m., a text arrived on the prepaid phone from a number she didn't recognize. I heard what happened tonight. If you're looking for somewhere to be tomorrow morning, I have a proposition. A D. She stared at it for a long moment. She didn't know the number. The initials meant nothing to her immediately, but then she did know them. Pulled from a specific memory, a specific day. 4 years ago at a conference in Geneva she had attended under Alessandro's name to manage a negotiation he had been too visible to conduct personally. An accidental conversation in a corridor. A financial structure she had noticed was incorrectly modeled, had mentioned as a passing observation to the man she was standing beside, and thought nothing more about. The man had been Adrian DeLuca. Victoria had not expected to hear from him again. Had not, in the intervening 4 years, thought about him more than twice. She looked at the text. Then she put the phone in her pocket, picked up the notepad, and walked out of the drugstore into the October night. She didn't respond. Not yet. She needed to understand something first. Needed to spend the next several hours sitting with the full weight of what had happened tonight and what it meant and what it would cost and what precisely she intended to do about it. She had $2,000 and a prepaid phone and a notepad full of her own intelligence. And she was 43 years old, and she had spent half of those years making someone else powerful. She needed to decide what she was going to do with the second half. 3 blocks from the drugstore, standing at a crosswalk while a delivery truck idled beside her, and the signal changed and the city continued its indifferent November business all around her, she stopped walking. She took the phone out of her pocket. She looked at Adrian DeLuca's text. Something about the phrasing, the directness of it, the absence of sympathy, the word proposition rather than offer or opportunity, told her something about the person who had sent it. She had spent 12 years in a world run by people who trafficked in weakness, who used sympathy as leverage and performed kindness as currency. Adrian DeLuca had not sent sympathy. He had sent a proposition. It was the first honest communication she had received in hours. She typed one word. When? His response arrived in under 30 seconds. 7 a.m. Send me where you are. She looked at the text, looked at the street around her, looked at her reflection in the dark window of the delivery truck as the light changed and traffic began to move. She sent him the name of the drugstore she'd just left. Then she put the phone away and kept walking, because she had a long night ahead of her and a great deal to think through. And she had never, in all her years of doing impossible things for a man who didn't deserve them, needed anyone to tell her what came next. She already knew. She just needed to survive until morning to begin it. What Victoria didn't know, what she couldn't have known, standing at that crosswalk with $2,000 and a notepad and a life reduced to its skeleton, was that Adrian DeLuca had not contacted her on impulse. He had known what happened at the Meridian Grand within 40 minutes of it occurring. He had known because he had a source inside the Romano organization. And he had known, for 4 years, that the accidental conversation in a Geneva corridor had not been accidental at all on his side. That he had positioned himself in that specific hallway at that specific moment because he had been watching Victoria Bennett's invisible work from a distance for longer than she would have believed. He had a proposition, yes, but the proposition was not quite what Victoria was imagining. And by morning, she would have to decide whether the most dangerous offer of her life was also the only one worth taking. Adrian DeLuca's car arrived at 6:53 a.m. Not a driver with a placard, not a town car idling ostentatiously at the curb. A black sedan, mid-range, the kind that disappeared in city traffic, with Adrian himself in the passenger seat and a man she didn't recognize behind the wheel. The car stopped directly in front of her without ceremony, and the window came down. And Adrian looked at her the way she imagined a structural engineer looked at a building he was considering purchasing, with attention, without sentiment, cataloging load-bearing points. "You slept," he said. It wasn't a question. 3 hours. She had found a hotel 6 blocks from the drugstore, paid cash, set an alarm for 5:30, and spent the intervening time reviewing the notes she'd made and adding to them. In a chair. "Get in." She got in. The sedan pulled into traffic without any of the hesitation she associated with men who wanted to perform generosity. No pause to ensure she was comfortable, no offer of coffee, no preliminary expressions of sympathy. Adrian turned to face forward and said nothing for 4 blocks, which she appreciated more than she expected to. Then, "Do you know why I texted you last night?" "I have a hypothesis." "Tell me." "Geneva, 4 years ago, the Hartwell Fund structure." She kept her voice even. Outside, the city scrolled past, October light coming in flat and gray through the windows. "I noticed an error in their liability modeling. You were standing in that corridor. I mentioned it to you because you happened to be there." And within 6 months, Hartwell restructured its entire model, avoided a regulatory disaster that would have cost investors somewhere north of $300 million, and quietly became one of the most stable, mid-size funds in the European market. She paused. "I noticed." "You noticed 6 months later." "I noticed 3 weeks later. I waited 6 months to verify I was right." She looked at him directly for the first time since getting in the car. You saved your position in that fund. What was it? 8% equity? 9.4. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. You did the math. I do the math on everything. He studied her for a moment. She let him. She had been studied by powerful men her entire adult life, had learned that the correct response was neither to perform discomfort nor to perform indifference, but simply to remain entirely present and let them arrive at whatever conclusion the evidence supported. I have a company, Adrian said, one of 23 subsidiaries inside my logistics group. It's been losing money for 31 months. I've had 4 executives attempt a turnaround. All 4 failed. My board has recommended I liquidate. What sector? Regional freight and cold chain distribution. Mid-Atlantic corridor. She thought for a moment. Asset heavy. Probably overcapitalized when it was acquired, and the fixed costs became unsustainable when fuel margins compressed. He looked at her. That's a reasonable hypothesis, she said. Based on nothing, I'd need the actual numbers. You'd have them by 9 a.m. The car stopped in front of a building she didn't recognize, a converted warehouse in the Port District, 12 stories, the kind of exterior that communicated deliberate anonymity. Adrian opened his door. One condition, he said, not looking back at her. Name it. You fix the company or you don't. I don't intervene. I don't extend resources. I don't make introductions on your behalf. Whatever you build here, you build without my name attached to it. He paused on the sidewalk, one hand on the car door. I've watched you work from the outside for 4 years. I want to see what you look like from the inside. He finally looked at her. Without a safety net. Victoria thought about the $2,000, about the plastic chair, about Alessandro's face at the podium, easy and certain, saying the Romano organization moves forward like she had been a weather system that had passed. All right, she said. All right, he repeated, and then, very precisely, don't thank me. I wasn't going to. She followed him inside. The company was called Crestline Distribution. The offices occupied the 4th floor of the converted warehouse, and Victoria understood within 45 seconds of walking through the door that the building's deliberate exterior anonymity was not a stylistic choice, but a symptom. The organization had been contracting inward for so long that it had developed an institutional posture of apology. Fluorescent lights, cubicle dividers that didn't match, a break room with a coffee machine that had an out-of-order sign that looked, based on the yellowing of the tape, like it had been there for approximately a year. The staff watched her cross the floor with the specific quality of attention that people pay to strangers who arrive in the company of the person who controls their employment. Cautious. Assessing. A few faces carried something that looked like pity, which told her they had already heard about last night. Of course they had. Alessandro had designed it to travel. The office she was given was a glass-walled room at the far end of the floor that had previously been used, based on the residue of whiteboard marker on every surface, as a war room for a turnaround strategy that had clearly not succeeded. Someone had left a half-completed org chart on the largest whiteboard. She looked at it for a moment, then erased it entirely with 3 long strokes. The financial files arrived at 8:57 a.m. in the form of a drive delivered by a young woman named Sue Lin, who introduced herself as the acting CFO with the tone of someone who had been acting in a position long enough to resent the word acting, and who set the drive on the desk and said, "We had an outside consultant in March who spent 6 weeks on this and left without a recommendation." What did the consultant charge? Sue Lin blinked. $80,000 for the engagement. Did they read the contracts? Which contracts? The supplier contracts, the carrier agreements. Victoria plugged in the drive. The lease structures on the refrigerated unit specifically. I think so. Yes. Sit down. Sue Lin sat. Victoria read for 4 hours without stopping. She read the way she had always read financial documents, not linearly, but in a specific sequence of her own design, cross-referencing receivables against contract terms, against capital depreciation, against the operational cost structure in a pattern that built a 3-dimensional picture of the company's actual mechanics rather than its presented condition. The coffee machine in her office worked. She drank 3 cups and didn't taste any of them. At 1 p.m., she looked up. The March consultant recommended restructuring, she said. That's right. Standard turnaround playbook, cut headcount, renegotiate carrier agreements, extend the runway. Yes. Did anyone actually read the refrigerated unit leases? Sulin's expression answered the question before she did. The lease structures on Crestline's cold chain equipment were the kind of document that looked on a surface reading like operational overhead, monthly payments against a 7-year term, nothing unusual. But buried in paragraph 41 of the master lease agreement was a buyout clause that activated at the 36-month mark, at a price that had been fixed in the original negotiation based on equipment valuations from a market peak 3 years ago. The current market value of the same equipment was significantly higher. The clause was terminable with 90 days' notice. If Crestline exercised the buyout, the equipment, which appeared on the books as a lease liability, became a hard asset worth approximately 40% more than the buyout price. The company wasn't a turnaround candidate, it was a misread asset. Who knows about this clause? Victoria asked. I'm not sure anyone has read the full. Find out, quietly. Don't discuss it with anyone outside this room until I tell you otherwise. Victoria stood and moved to the whiteboard. And pull me everything on Veritas Cold Chain. They're in the same corridor, correct? They're our largest competitor. Sulin stopped. They've been struggling. Their lead investor pulled out in August. Victoria wrote 2 numbers on the whiteboard. Call me if anyone from the board contacts you before tomorrow morning, she said. She worked through the night, not in the office, in the hotel room she upgraded to using the corporate card Su Lin had provided, at a desk by the window with the city spread out below her, her notepad from the drugstore now dense with calculations and connection points, and the specific kind of structural map she built when she was working through something that required simultaneous understanding of multiple interdependent systems. She ordered room service at midnight and ate without tasting it and kept working. By 4 a.m., she had a plan. It was not the plan anyone expected. The board meeting convened at 10 a.m. the following morning in a conference room on the 12th floor that smelled of new carpet and old anxiety. 9 people around the table, most of whom had clearly expected to be discussing liquidation timelines. Victoria arrived 2 minutes early and sat at the far end of the table from the head position, which was where people sat when they wanted to be underestimated, and which was where she had been sitting, metaphorically, for 12 years. So she had the rhythm of it down. The board chair was a man named Gerald Park, 60-something, the kind of executive who had spent his career in rooms like this one and had learned to read shifting power balances the way other people read weather. He looked at her across the table with visible skepticism and barely concealed condescension and said, "We've reviewed your preliminary assessment. We'd like to understand your restructuring timeline." "I'm not restructuring," Victoria said. The room stilled. "Ms. Bennett, I'm selling the operating entity." She placed a document in the center of the table and let the silence sit for a moment while people processed what they were reading. The equipment assets separately, following a buyout at the 36-month clause price, which triggers in 19 days. The operating entity goes to a buyer I've identified who needs the carrier network and doesn't need the equipment. The equipment, after buyout, gets contributed into a new holding structure alongside the Veritas cold chain assets, which I'm acquiring simultaneously. Gerald Park looked at her the way men often looked at her when she said things they hadn't anticipated, with a specific kind of blankness that was covering a rapid internal recalculation. "Veritas is a competitor," he said finally. "Veritas is insolvent and has assets their creditors don't fully understand. Their refrigerated fleet is worth 40% more than it appears on their balance sheet because of a maintenance capitalization error. Combined with Crestline's equipment post-buyout, the new holding structure controls the most efficient cold chain asset base in the Mid-Atlantic corridor." She looked around the table. "This isn't a turnaround. It's a consolidation play that was invisible until someone read the contracts." The room was very quiet. "What's our exposure if Veritas's creditors reject the acquisition terms?" asked a woman named Chen at the middle of the table, the only person who had been taking notes, which Victoria had noted and filed. "Minimal. The Veritas acquisition is structured as an asset purchase, not a share purchase. We're buying the fleet and the carrier agreements, not the entity. Their creditors get a clean exit. Their management team goes away." Victoria paused. Nobody loses except the people who spent 3 years mismanaging it. Another silence. Gerald Park leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man who had expected to be the most capable person in the room and was adjusting to evidence that he was not. Adrian said you'd surprise us, he said. Adrian doesn't know the details of this plan, she said. He knows you. She didn't respond to that. She gathered her documents and said, I need authorization to proceed in 48 hours. If I don't have it, the buyout window on the equipment clause tightens, and the Veritas creditor situation changes. Both are time-sensitive. She stood. I'll be in my office. She was halfway to the door when Chen said, Miss Bennett. She stopped. The March consultant was Gerald's nephew, Chen said. Victoria looked at Gerald Park. He held her gaze with the particular expression of a man who had just watched someone else identify a piece on the board he thought was invisible. That explains the 80,000, Victoria said, and walked out. She was in her office for 30 minutes, reviewing the Veritas creditor documentation, when her new phone rang. Unknown number. She answered it on the second ring. You're moving fast, Alessandro's voice. Calm. The specific calibrated calm he used when he was managing something that was making him angry. She felt her shoulders go rigid and consciously released the tension before it could settle into her posture permanently. She had known he would surface. She had expected it would take longer. How did you get this number? She asked. You activated a phone at a drugstore on Merchant Street at 11:40 p.m. You checked into the Aldine Hotel at 12:15. You arrived at a DeLuca subsidiary building at 7 a.m. A pause. I know where you are, Victoria. I've always known where you are. Then you also know what I'm doing. I know what you think you're doing. His voice shifted slightly. Not warmer, something more precise. I'm calling because I want you to stop. I'm going to need more than that. I'm offering you a settlement, outside the divorce terms. Separate, private, handled through Richard. Significant. Another pause. This DeLuca arrangement isn't what you think it is. He has his own reasons for bringing you in, and they don't serve your interests. What do you care about my interests? I care about containing situations that threaten the organization. There it was. Not concern, containment. She had spent 12 years being contained and had confused it, for most of that time, with being valued. I'm going to decline, she said. Victoria, don't call this number again. She ended the call. She set the phone on the desk and stared at it for a moment. Her heart was moving faster than she wanted it to, and her hands were not quite steady, and she pressed them flat against the desk surface and breathed through it, the way she had learned to breathe through things. Slow and deliberate and without theatrics, because theatrics cost energy she needed elsewhere. Then she picked up the phone and called Su Lin. Has anyone from outside the organization contacted you in the last hour? A pause. A man called for me about 40 minutes ago. He said he was from a compliance review firm. He wanted to know about our current leadership structure. What did you tell him? I said I'd call him back. Another pause. Should I not have answered? You did fine. Don't call him back, and change your personal cell number today. She thought for a moment. Who else in the office received calls this morning? The list Su Lin compiled over the next 20 minutes contained 7 names. All 7 had received calls from different numbers, all presenting as compliance or regulatory contacts, all asking variations of the same question. Who was running operations and what was the status of current leadership? It was a reconnaissance pattern. Alessandro was mapping the organization before applying pressure. Victoria had 19 days before the equipment buyout clause activated. She estimated, significantly less time than that before Alessandro found a mechanism to complicate it. She went back to the documents and kept working. On day 4, the board authorized her plan by a 6-3 margin. Gerald Park voted against, along with 2 others she had already identified as loyalty risks. She filed that information and proceeded without comment. The authorization was what mattered. On day 6, the Veritas acquisition entered its initial phase. On day 8, the first sign of Alessandro's pressure campaign arrived in the form of a call from the primary lender on the Veritas creditor pool, informing her that the terms of the asset purchase were under review due to a regulatory inquiry that had been initiated by an unnamed third party. She was not surprised. She had been waiting for something like this since the morning of day 5, when the specific silence from Alessandro's direction had begun to feel less like retreat and more like preparation. She spent day 8 and day 9 restructuring the financing entirely, removing the primary lender and replacing them with 3 smaller institutions that Alessandro had no relationship with, which she had identified weeks earlier as contingency capital and quietly pre-positioned. It cost her 2 days of sleep and approximately 4 years off her projected lifespan, but the structure held. On day 10, Adrian DeLuca walked into her office for the first time since she'd started. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the whiteboard, which was covered in what most people would have interpreted as organized chaos, and which was actually a complete operational map of the consolidation strategy in its current state. He looked at it for a long time. "Romano's applying pressure," he said. "Yes, I'm aware." He moved into the room and sat in the chair across from her desk, the only chair because she had removed the others, a habit she'd developed to prevent extended meetings. "I want to make sure you understand my position." "I know your position." She set down her pen. "You told me on day 1, you don't intervene." "That's correct?" She waited. 3 of my senior partners have been contacted by Romano's people. They're being offered favorable terms on existing arrangements in exchange for pressuring me to dissolve your contract. He said it without inflection, the way she imagined a physician-delivered test results. "I'm telling you this because it's information relevant to your situation, not because I'm asking you to do anything differently." "What did your partners say?" "2 of them declined. 1 is considering." He paused. "The one who is considering controls access to the bonded warehouse network you need for the Veritas carrier integration." She felt the cold move through her chest, the specific cold of a structural problem arriving faster than projected. "How long do I have?" "Before he decides?" Adrian tilted his head slightly. 48 hours, maybe 72. "I need the bonded network access for day 14. The carrier agreements transfer on the 15th. "I know." He stood. "I'm not telling you this to help you. I'm telling you this because you deserve to have accurate information about the board you're playing on." He paused at the door. "What you do with it is your own business." He left. Victoria sat for exactly 60 seconds doing nothing. She allowed the full weight of it to register. Alessandro's campaign, the bonded network access, the timeline compressing from both ends, the specific quality of loneliness that accompanied working inside a crisis without allies or safety margins. She felt all of it, because suppressing it would just mean it surfaced at a worse moment. She let it move through and pass, and then she picked up her pen and turned to a clean page in the notepad. The bonded warehouse network was controlled by Adrian's partner through a holding company that had 3 other investors. She knew this because she had read every ownership structure in the DeLuca organization before she started. Not because she planned to need the information, but because she read everything. One of those 3 other investors was a logistics firm based in Baltimore that had a competing bonded network it had been trying to activate for 2 years but couldn't get certified because of a regulatory overlap with the existing network. If the existing network access was removed from Victoria's deal, the Veritas carrier integration failed. But if the competing Baltimore network became relevant, its owner had every incentive to expedite its own certification, which required cooperation from the existing network's operating license, which meant the partner who was considering Alessandro's offer held leverage he may not have fully understood was two-sided. She made 3 calls in the next hour. The first was to the Baltimore logistics firm. The second was to the regulatory certification body for bonded warehouse networks. The third was to a maritime attorney who had done quiet work for her, through Alessandro, 6 years ago, and who owed her a favor she had never called in. On day 13, Adrian's wavering partner received a formal notification that his bonded network's operating license was under review for a certification overlap with the Baltimore firm's pending application. The review would take, at minimum, 60 days to resolve. During that period, the existing network could continue operations but could not enter new contractual relationships. He called Adrian. Adrian called no one. He walked into Victoria's office on day 13 at 6 p.m. and stood in the doorway again and looked at her and said nothing for a long time. You didn't use my name, he said finally. You told me not to. You also didn't ask me for anything. You told me not to do that either. She looked up from the documents. The carrier agreement transfers on schedule tomorrow. The equipment buyout closes on day 19. The consolidated entity is fully structured. She set down her pen. The board was right that Crestline needed to go. They were wrong about what it was worth and wrong about what to do with it. Adrian looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between assessment and something more specific that she filed away for later examination. Alessandro's people are going to escalate, he said. They've been cut out of 2 moves now. He doesn't respond well to that. I know how he responds. She began organizing the documents on her desk. He'll go after financing next. He'll identify the institutions I'm using and apply relationship pressure to have terms restructured or commitments withdrawn. She looked up. Which is why I've already moved the primary capital position to 3 institutions he has no relationship with and cannot reach without a 6-month runway, which he doesn't have. Adrian was quiet for a moment. How far ahead are you? He asked. Far enough, she paused. He's going to be more aggressive than he's been. Whatever he does next will be less subtle. Are you prepared for that? She thought about the plastic chair in the drugstore, the notepad, the $2,000, the specific quality of Alessandro's voice on the phone, calm, controlled, the performance of a man who had never genuinely believed she could operate without him. I've been prepared for it for about 12 years, she said. Adrian nodded once. He turned to go. At the door, he stopped. The board wants to present the Crestline consolidation at the Global Strategic Investment Summit next month. He kept his back to her. They want me to present it. That makes sense. I told them the architect of the strategy should present it. He paused. They asked who that was. The room was very quiet. What did you tell them? She asked. He turned around and looked at her with the same expression he'd worn in the doorway on day 1. The structural engineer, the load-bearing points, except that something in it had changed, had acquired a weight it hadn't carried before. I told them they were about to find out, he said. And that was when Victoria understood that the summit wasn't a presentation opportunity. It was a confrontation, designed, deliberate, and unavoidable. And Alessandro Romano was going to be in that room, and so was she, and whatever happened next would not be containable and would not be private and would not leave either of them where they stood. She looked at Adrian. When does it start? She asked. 3 weeks, he said. And Victoria, he paused in the doorway, and for just a moment something crossed his face that wasn't calculation or assessment or the careful neutrality he had maintained for 13 days. Alessandro just registered as a keynote presenter. He's announcing a major acquisition at the summit, the largest expansion the Romano organization has ever attempted. She felt something move through her that wasn't fear and wasn't anger, but was the particular electric clarity that arrived when a situation reached its true center of gravity. What's the acquisition? She asked. Adrian placed a single sheet of paper on the edge of her desk and walked out without answering. She picked it up. She read it. The acquisition target was a company she recognized immediately. Recognized not from news coverage or market analysis, but from memory, from 4 a.m. mornings and financial models she had built in the dark while Alessandro slept, from a strategy she had authored 6 years ago that had never been implemented because the timing wasn't right, a strategy she had left in the internal system under a file name that only she would recognize and that Alessandro's team had clearly found and repurposed and was now presenting to the world as his own masterstroke, her strategy, her work, her name on nothing. She set the paper down on the desk. For a long time she sat without moving, listening to the sounds of the building settling around her. The distant hum of the city, the elevator running somewhere below, the particular silence of an office in the late evening when the work of the day has resolved into the work of the next one. Then she picked up her pen and began to write the presentation that would end Alessandro Romano's empire in front of everyone who had ever believed it was his. She worked for 6 days straight, not continuously. She slept in 3-hour windows, ate when Sulin brought food to the office and left it on the corner of the desk without comment, drank coffee that went cold before she remembered it existed. The presentation grew in layers the way structural things grew, from foundation outward, each element load-bearing, nothing decorative. She was not building an argument. She was building a A documented, sourced, time-stamped record of every significant financial decision the Romano organization had made over 12 years, cross-referenced against the internal files she had preserved, and the acquisition strategy Alessandro was about to present to the world as his own. On the third day, Su Lin knocked on the glass wall and said, "There's someone here. I'm not available." She says she worked for Romano's financial division. She says she has something you need to see. Victoria looked up. The woman waiting in the reception area was perhaps 35, dark-haired, wearing a suit that was slightly too large, the kind of suit that suggested recent weight loss, the physical language of prolonged stress. She was standing with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and the specific expression of someone who had made a decision they were not entirely at peace with and had committed to it anyway. Victoria came out to meet her. "I'm Elena Marsh," the woman said. "I was a senior analyst in Romano's internal strategy division for 4 years. I left 8 months ago." "Why did you leave?" Elena looked at her steadily. "Because of you." They went into the glass office. Elena sat in the single chair. Victoria stood, which was not a power play. She simply thought better on her feet. "Explain that," Victoria said. 3 years ago, Marco Venn called a meeting of the senior analysts. He told us that certain internal documents, strategy files, financial models, analysis packages, were going to be reclassified, removed from the shared system, attributed to a consolidated source rather than individual authors. Elena's voice was controlled, but her hands were gripping each other in her lap with visible force. He said it was a structural simplification, cleaner internal record keeping. What was it actually? He removed every document that had your name on it, every one, and he reclassified them under a collective attribution, Romano Strategy Group. A pause. Some of them he just attributed directly to Alessandro. Victoria said nothing. She kept her face still and her breathing even and stood in the center of the room while the information settled into the architecture of everything she already knew, fitting into spaces she had suspected for years and never confirmed. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because I kept copies." Elena reached into her bag and placed a drive on the desk. Of everything Venn reclassified, the original files with original metadata, timestamps, author credentials, revision histories. She looked up. "Your name is on 417 documents." The number landed differently than Victoria expected. She had known, abstractly, that her contribution was extensive. She had kept her own copies, her own records, but 417 had a specificity to it, a weight that the abstract hadn't carried. "Why did you keep them?" Victoria asked. "Because I'm an analyst," Elena said. "I keep everything." A pause. "And because what Venn did was wrong, and I couldn't say that while I was inside, and I couldn't say it after I left without a target. You're the target now." Her jaw tightened. "He's going to stand up at that summit and present a strategy that you built 6 years ago, and he's going to look like a visionary, and you are going to be invisible, and I am—" She stopped, breathed. "I'm not willing to let that happen again." Victoria looked at the drive. "Have you been contacted by anyone from Romano's organization since you left?" she asked. "No." "Have you told anyone you were coming here?" "No." "Where are the copies stored?" 3 locations. The drive, a cloud archive with 2-factor access, and a physical backup at my attorney's office. Victoria finally sat down, pulled a second chair from the corner where she kept it folded against the wall, and sat directly across from Elena, which she had not done with anyone since she'd occupied this office. "Marco Venn is going to find out you came here," she said. "Probably within a few days. He has people." Elena's expression didn't change. "I know." "When he does, he'll move against you, professionally, possibly personally." She held the woman's gaze. "I want you to understand that before we go any further." "I understand." "Do you?" Elena looked at her for a long moment. "Ms. Bennett, I watched what they did to you for 3 years from inside that organization. I watched Venn take your work and strip your name from it and hand it to a man who never understood half of what he was being given. And I watched Alessandro Romano receive applause for it. And I watched you stand in rooms and say nothing because you had decided, for reasons I never fully understood but recognized, that the work was what mattered. Her voice was steady. I am not afraid of Marco Venn. Victoria picked up the drive. I need 24 hours to verify the metadata, she said. Take what you need. And I need you to stay somewhere that isn't your home address for the next 3 weeks. Elena nodded once and stood. At the door, she paused. There's something else. Victoria waited. The acquisition Alessandro is presenting at the summit. Elena turned back. The target company, the strategy he's using. A pause. The financing isn't real. The room went very still. Explain that, Victoria said. The lead investor in the acquisition, the one providing 60% of the capital commitment, is a shell. 3 layers of holding companies. The underlying account is Alessandro's own capital, cycled through offshore structures to make it appear as independent institutional investment. Elena's voice had gone quieter, more careful. He's presenting a self-funded acquisition as a market-backed deal. To investors. To partners. To every Mafia family with a seat at the summit. Victoria stared at her. He's inflating the validation, she said slowly. He's manufacturing consensus, making it look like major independent capital is backing him to pressure other investors to commit before due diligence is completed. Elena's hands were still in her lap. It's securities fraud, multiple counts, and it's built on a strategy he stole from you, which means when it collapses, my name is on the architecture, Victoria said. Elena said nothing. Victoria set the drive on the desk and looked at it for a long time. The thing Alessandro had not understood, had never understood, even after 12 years of proximity to the way her mind worked, was that she did not plan linearly. She did not build a strategy and then execute it. She built a strategy and simultaneously built the contingencies for the strategy's failure and the contingencies for those contingencies in layers, because she had learned early that the most dangerous thing an intelligent person could do was fall in love with their own plan. She had come to the summit prepared to expose his theft of her intellectual work. She had not come prepared for this, for the possibility that the stolen work was now the scaffolding for a crime that would, if it detonated incorrectly, attach itself to her name regardless of ownership. How long have you known about the shell structure? She asked. I found it 6 weeks ago. I've been verifying it since. You waited. I needed to be certain. Elena paused. And I needed to know what you were going to do. Victoria looked at her. What made you decide? He filed the summit presentation 3 days ago. I read it. A pause. He's not just using your strategy. He's using your exact language. Specific phrases, paragraphs. She reached into her bag again and produced a printed page. A single sheet, 2 columns, text on the left, text on the right. Left column is from your original file, dated 6 years ago. Right column is Alessandro's summit presentation, filed 3 days ago. Victoria took the page. She read the left column, her own words. She remembered writing them, remembered the specific morning, the light coming through the kitchen window at a particular angle, the quiet of the apartment at 5 a.m. The feeling she had sometimes when she was working through something genuinely difficult of existing entirely inside her own mind, everything else receding. She read the right column. They were identical. Not similar, not parallel. Identical, down to the punctuation. She set the page on the desk beside the drive. Thank you, she said, for coming. Elena left. Victoria sat in the empty office for a long time. Outside, the city was doing its ordinary business. Below, she could hear the muffled sounds of Su Lin managing something on the phone, the elevator running, a distant argument in the street. Ordinary sounds. The ordinary architecture of a day that had just become something else entirely. She picked up her phone and called Adrian. He answered on the second ring. I need to meet, she said. When? Now. 40 minutes later, they were sitting across from each other in a conference room on the 12th floor, the city visible through a wall of windows, late afternoon light coming in flat and gray. Victoria placed the drive on the table. She placed Elena's comparative page on the table. She placed her own summary document, 3 pages, single-spaced, on the table. Adrian read everything without speaking. He read slowly and carefully and with a specific quality of attention that told her he was not reading for comprehension. He already understood what he was reading, but for implications, for the downstream consequences that most people took several days to identify. When he finished, he set the documents down and looked at her. "The shell structure," he said. "Yes. If you expose the intellectual theft at the summit without addressing the shell structure, you blow up his presentation and his credibility on the acquisition strategy." He paused. "But the acquisition still proceeds with a different narrative. He claims independent misappropriation by his team, distances himself from the strategy theft, reframes it as institutional error." "Yes, but if you expose the shell structure, the entire acquisition collapses. The independent investment was the validation every other investor was using to justify their commitment. Without it, they pull out. Without committed investors, the acquisition fails." She paused. "And he faces fraud charges, along with anyone whose name appears in the strategy documentation. Which is why I need to address both simultaneously," she said. "The theft and the fraud. In the same presentation. In the correct sequence so the audience understands the theft before they understand the fraud, because otherwise the fraud narrative consumes everything and the theft becomes a footnote." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "Who else knows about the shell structure?" "Elena Marsh, her attorney, and whoever Alessandro used to build it, who has every incentive to stay invisible." "The summit is in 10 days. "I know." He leaned back in his chair. Outside, a cloud moved and the light changed, sharpened for a moment and then diffused again. "Victoria." His voice had changed, shifted from the careful neutrality he maintained to something more direct, more specific. "I need to tell you something." She looked at him. "The summit presentation. The decision to have you present the Crestline consolidation." He paused. "It wasn't the board's idea." She waited. "I designed the situation," he said. "I knew Alessandro was presenting. I knew what he was presenting. I've had a source inside his organization for 2 years." He held her gaze without flinching. "I brought you in, to Crestline, to the consolidation, to this position, because I needed someone with direct knowledge of the Romano operation and the standing to credibly present its dismantling at a venue where it would be witnessed by every person who needed to see it." The room was very quiet. Victoria did not move. She sat with the information and let it settle, let the architecture of it resolve, because her mind needed to work through it properly, rather than react to the surface of it. "You knew about the acquisition strategy," she said. "The stolen work." "I knew he was presenting something built on your work. I didn't know the extent of it until you told me." "The shell structure?" "I suspected. I didn't have confirmation." "Did you know about Elena Marsh?" He paused, a fraction of a second longer than a simple no required. "I knew she existed. I didn't approach her." Victoria looked at him for a long time. The structural engineer, the load-bearing points. She had been reading him for weeks now, had built a model of how he operated, and she ran the current information against that model and checked for contradictions and found fewer than she expected, which was itself a piece of information. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because you would find out," he said simply. "You already had enough to find it on your own, and I would rather you hear it from me." "That's practical." "It's also true." He leaned forward slightly. "I brought you in because I needed your capability in a specific context. But what you've done here, the Crestline consolidation, the bonded network problem, the way you've handled Romano's pressure campaign, that was not what I designed. That exceeded what I designed." A pause. "I'm not telling you this to apologize. I'm telling you this because you deserve to operate with accurate information about the board you're on." She recognized the phrase. He'd used it before. She filed that too. "And the summit presentation?" she asked. "Is yours. Entirely. Whatever you build, however you build it." He paused. "I have one request." "Name it." "Don't warn him," Adrian said. "Don't give him any window to restructure or deflect. Whatever you do at that summit, it needs to land completely before he has time to respond." She looked at him. "That was already my plan," she said. 3 days before the summit, everything fell apart. She was in the office at 6 a.m. when Sulin called her personal number instead of the office line. which was their agreed signal for something that couldn't wait. The metadata, Sulin said. Her voice was tight. On the drive Elena gave you, I've been running the verification. And? A pause that lasted too long. The timestamps have been altered, Sulin said. Not all of them. 42 of the 417 files. The alteration is subtle. Whoever did it knew what they were doing, but the hash values don't match the creation dates on the altered files. Victoria stood up from her desk. Which 42? She asked. The most recent ones, the ones that most directly match Alessandro's summit presentation. Sulin's voice had gone quieter. If he challenges the metadata in a legal context, he can argue those 42 files were created after his presentation was filed, that you backdated them to support a fraud claim. The cold moved through her chest again, sharper this time. When was the alteration made? She asked. Based on the hash discrepancy, sometime in the past 2 weeks. After Elena came to me. Yes. Victoria sat back down slowly. She pressed her hand flat against the desk and stared at the wall and thought, with a speed and precision that felt from the inside like controlled panic, through the possibilities. Elena had said 3 backup locations: the drive, the cloud archive, the attorney's office. If the drive had been compromised, the question was when and how. Elena had said she'd been verifying the shell structure for 6 weeks. Someone had been watching Elena for at least that long. And someone with the technical capability to alter file metadata without obvious detection was not someone Alessandro used casually. Pull the chain of custody on the drive, she said. From when Elena gave it to me to when you started the verification. Every person who had physical access to this office. That's, Ms. Bennett, that's 12 people. Staff, maintenance, the board members who came through for the Day 9 review. All 12. Today. She paused. And I need you to pull the cloud archive directly from Elena's credentials, not the drive copy, the cloud source. I don't have her credentials. Call her, now. Don't explain. Just tell her we need direct access to the cloud archive for verification and that it's urgent. She hung up and stood at the window and looked out at the city and did something she almost never did, which was to close her eyes and hold them closed for a full 30 seconds and let herself feel the specific texture of the situation she was in. The pressure from all sides, the compressed timeline, the manipulated evidence, the knowledge that someone inside the building or connected to it had access to her operations. 30 seconds. Then she opened her eyes and went back to work. The cloud archive, when Sulin accessed it 2 hours later, was clean, unaltered. The hash values matched. The 417 files were intact, unmodified, with original metadata that predated Alessandro's presentation by years, which meant someone had altered only the drive, which meant someone had access to the physical drive after Elena delivered it and before Sulin began verification, which meant the attack was designed not to destroy the evidence, but to contaminate it, to introduce enough doubt that any legal proceeding would become a question of which copy was authentic, the drive or the cloud, and who had the resources to sustain that argument the longest. Alessandro had those resources. Victoria did not. She had the cloud archive, which was clean, and she had Elena's attorney's physical backup, which she hadn't yet verified, and she had 10 days until the summit, and she had no legal team, no institutional backing, and no margin for error. She also had something Alessandro did not know she had, because he had underestimated her for 12 years, and had not stopped underestimating her even after she had demonstrated, multiple times, that she was not someone who operated without contingencies. She picked up the phone and called the maritime attorney who had done quiet work for her 6 years ago. I need you to refer me to someone, she said. Securities Fraud International, the best person you know who doesn't owe any favors to the Romano organization. That's a short list. How short? 1 name. A pause. She's expensive. I have the Crestline consolidation proceeds clearing in 4 days, Victoria said. I have resources. She got the name. She called the attorney, a woman named Patricia Sorrell, who answered her own phone at 7 a.m. and whose first question, before Victoria had finished explaining the situation, was, do you have original metadata that predates the alleged theft? Cloud archive. Unaltered. Is it independently hosted? Third-party server. Registered in Elena's name, not mine. A pause. Send me everything. Tonight. Another pause. And Ms. Bennett, the summit is in 10 days. I know. That's not enough time to build a legal case. I'm not building a legal case, Victoria said. I'm building a presentation. Sorrel was quiet for a moment. Explain the distinction. A legal case requires a courtroom. A presentation requires an audience. Victoria looked out the window at the city. The summit audience includes every investor, every partner, and every rival organization that Alessandro Romano has spent 20 years cultivating. If what I present at that summit is accurate, sourced, and documented, the market does the rest, Sorrel said. The market does the rest. Another silence. Then, send me everything tonight. On day 7 before the summit, the second piece of the floor fell out. She was reviewing the presentation structure. She had built it in 4 layers, each one designed to be comprehensible independently, but devastating in sequence. When her phone rang, Adrian's number. Where are you? He said. Office, why? Come to the 12th floor, now. A pause. Don't come through the main lobby. She took the service stairs. Adrian was in the conference room with a man she didn't recognize, say 50s, compact, with the particular stillness of someone trained to maintain physical neutrality in high-stress environments. This is Graves, Adrian said. He manages security for my organization. Graves looked at her without expression. Miss Bennett, we have a problem. Tell me. Your contact, Elena Marsh. He paused, precise and flat. She was picked up this morning by 2 men outside her apartment. We don't know where she is. The floor did not drop out from under her. She had expected something like this, had known, from the moment Elena walked into her office, that the exposure came with a cost, and that the cost would likely not be hers to pay directly. Knowing it and hearing it were 2 different things. She breathed through it. When? She asked. 6 a.m. A neighbor saw it. Didn't recognize the men. Romano's people? Almost certainly. Graves paused. She had a go bag prepared. It wasn't in her apartment when we checked. Victoria looked at him. You checked her apartment? We've been watching her since she came to see you, Adrian said. Precautionary. Did she know that? No. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. The structural engineer again. Load-bearing points. She was recalculating the model of him in real time, adding new elements, adjusting weight distributions. Is she alive? She asked. We believe so, Graves said. Romano needs her to recant. If she's dead, she can't recant. Which means he has a window to use her. Victoria turned to the window. Which means I have the same window. Victoria, Adrian started. The attorney's office, she said. The physical backup. Is it secured? Graves and Adrian exchanged a look. Ms. Bennett, Graves said carefully. The attorney, a man named Holloway in Midtown, was contacted this morning by a representative claiming to be Elena's family member, requesting the contents of her file on an emergency basis. Did he release it? He called Elena's cell first. No answer. A pause. He's currently following his standard protocol and has not released anything. How long does that protocol hold? 24 hours. After that, without contact from Elena, he has discretion. Victoria checked her watch. It was 9:43 a.m. By 9:43 a.m., tomorrow, the physical backup could be gone. I need to get into that attorney's office today, she said. You have no legal standing, Adrian said. Elena gave me verbal authorization. I have it recorded. She turned. The night she came here, she called me from the lobby before coming up. I recorded the conversation on the office system as a matter of practice. She authorized me verbally to access her documents in the event of her incapacitation. A pause. I need Patricia Sorrel on the phone in the next 30 minutes, and I need Holloway's address. Adrian looked at her for a moment. You recorded her call, he said. I record everything. She met his gaze. It's a habit I developed working for a man who revised history. She had the address and Sorrel on the phone within 20 minutes. By noon, she was in Holloway's office. a quiet suite in Midtown with framed diplomas and the particular organized solemnity of an attorney who took estate work seriously, presenting Sorel's authorization letter and a recording of Elena's verbal consent on her phone played through the speaker on Holloway's desk while he listened with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral. He released the backup at 12:47 p.m. She was back in the office by 2 p.m. with the physical backup in her hands, the cloud archive verified, and Patricia Sorrell building an independent forensic authentication of all three sources that would, within 72 hours, produce a documented chain of custody that could withstand any challenge Alessandro's legal team might construct. The evidence was intact. Elena's location was still unknown. The summit was in 9 days. Victoria sat at her desk and worked. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, building and rebuilding the presentation, testing every sequence for weakness, every claim for vulnerability, every piece of evidence for the specific kind of fragility that revealed itself only under sustained hostile examination. She was not building a speech. She was building a structure designed to remain standing after Alessandro Romano and every resource he possessed had tried to bring it down. At 8 p.m., Sue Lin knocked on the glass. "There's a message," she said. "It came through the company's main address. No sender name." She handed Victoria a printed email. Victoria read it. 3 sentences. "I'm safe. The backup was the target, not me. They don't know about the cloud. No signature. Elena." Victoria read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of her jacket, next to her notepad from the drugstore. She looked at the presentation on her screen. 9 days. Alessandro Romano had spent 12 years standing in front of her work and letting the world believe it was his. He had built his empire on her intelligence, erased her name from 417 documents, manufactured false investment consensus using fraud, and, when she had finally stepped out of his shadow, had tried to contaminate her evidence, isolate her witnesses, and reduce her back to the woman walking out of the Meridian Grand with $2,000 and nowhere to go. He had done all of this because he believed, at the most fundamental level, that she required a structure to operate inside. That without his name, his organization, his architecture surrounding her, she was uncontainable. Raw capability without direction, intelligence without power. He had never understood that the architecture had always been hers. She turned back to the screen and began typing the final section of the presentation, the part she had been saving, the part that required not documentation or analysis or forensic authentication, but simply her own voice, precise and unadorned, saying what was true about what had been taken and what it meant, and what, in front of every powerful person in that room, it was going to cost. 9 days. She intended to use every hour of them, because when she walked onto that stage and looked at Alessandro Romano across an auditorium full of the world's most powerful people and told them the truth, she was not going to be the woman he had discarded. She was going to be the reason his empire ended. And she was going to make sure every person in that room understood with complete and irreversible clarity exactly who had built it in the first place. The Global Strategic Investment Summit occupied 3 floors of the Hargrove Center, a glass and steel tower in the financial district that had been designed by an architect who understood the psychology of power to make everyone inside it feel simultaneously elevated and exposed. Floor-to-ceiling windows, open sight lines, nowhere to hide and nowhere that didn't feel like a performance. Victoria arrived 40 minutes before the first session. She wore charcoal again, a different cut, sharper at the shoulders, the kind of structure that communicated something different from the dress she'd worn to the Meridian Grand 8 weeks ago. That dress had been designed to not be seen. This one was designed to be seen clearly. She had not slept in 31 hours. She was aware of this the way she was aware of the specific ache behind her eyes and the tightness across her shoulders, and the way her hands, when she let them rest, developed a faint tremor that she controlled by keeping them occupied. She carried a leather portfolio, the presentation, printed and tabbed, though she had no intention of reading from it, and a small earpiece through which Sue Lin would relay real-time information from outside the room. Patricia Sorrell had positioned herself in a hotel conference room 2 blocks away with the complete forensic authentication package, available electronically to every financial regulator, securities authority, and press contact on a distribution list that would activate at Victoria's signal. The signal was one word, texted to Sulin, "Now." She went through registration, collected her credentials, and stood for a moment in the main atrium watching people arrive. The summit drew a specific kind of attendee, people whose public presence was carefully managed and whose actual power operated in the spaces between official records. She recognized faces. Some recognized her and looked away. Some looked at her with the particular attention that signaled they had heard something and were recalibrating. She was looking for one face in particular. She found it at 8:52 a.m. Alessandro entered through the east entrance with Dante Ricci at his shoulder and Marco Venn 2 steps behind, and a security detail of 4 men positioned with the practiced spacing of people who had been doing this long enough to make it look accidental. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie, the collar open. The specific dress code of a man who wanted to project relaxed authority, the kind of power that didn't require a tie because it didn't need to perform itself. He saw her immediately. She had positioned herself in his direct sightline, which was not an accident. For 3 seconds, across the atrium, they looked at each other. His expression did not change. He was too controlled for that, had spent too many years in rooms where visible reaction was a liability. But something shifted behind his eyes. A recalibration. The specific adjustment of a man who is prepared for a version of events and has just received information that the version may be wrong. She held his gaze for those 3 seconds and then looked away, unhurried, and walked toward the registration desk to collect her panel credentials. She heard Dante's voice, low, behind her. "She looks—" "I see her," Alessandro said. She didn't look back. The morning sessions ran on schedule. Victoria sat through 2 panels, global logistics infrastructure, cross-border acquisition financing, and said nothing, took no notes, and spent the time running the presentation sequence through her mind for the last time, checking joints, testing load-bearing points. She had built it to land in 4 distinct movements: context, evidence, implication, consequence. Each movement designed to close the exits that came before it, so that by the time she reached consequence, there was no narrative available to Alessandro that didn't confirm what she had already established. At 11 a.m., Marco Venn sat down beside her. She did not look at him. "Miss Bennett." His voice was the voice she remembered. Smooth, slightly too smooth. The voice of a man who had spent his career translating other people's intelligence into his own vocabulary. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Yes, you did," she said. A pause. "Alessandro would like a word. Before the afternoon sessions." "No. It's not a request." She turned and looked at him directly for the first time. Marco Venn was 53 years old and had spent 4 years systematically removing her name from 417 documents, and she had spent the past 3 weeks looking at the evidence of that work. And the specific thing she felt looking at his face now was not anger. Anger was too general. But a precise and focused contempt that had the quality of a tool rather than an emotion. "Tell Alessandro," she said quietly, "that I'll see him from the stage." Venn's expression shifted. Something moved through it, a recognition, the first sign she had seen from anyone in Alessandro's circle that they understood the actual shape of what was coming. He stood and left without another word. Her earpiece activated. Sulin's voice, low and controlled. "Graves just flagged movement. 3 of Romano's security detail repositioned to the corridor outside the main auditorium. They're not covering the entrances. They're covering the stage access points." "How many?" 3 confirmed, possibly a 4th near the AV control room. "The AV control room?" She kept her voice level. "Why the AV room?" "The presentation feeds. If they get to the AV system before you start, can Graves cover it?" "Already moving." A pause. "Ms. Bennett? There's something else. Elena Marsh just walked into the building." Victoria went still. "She's registered as a press credential, under a different name." Sulin's voice was careful. She has a bruise on her left cheekbone. She's walking fine. She came through the east entrance 3 minutes ago." "Where is she now?" "Press section. Upper gallery." Victoria breathed. Elena had made it, had gotten herself credentialed and into the building and positioned in the press gallery where she could witness what was about to happen, and the bruise on her cheekbone told Victoria everything she needed to know about what the past 9 days had cost the woman. "Tell Graves to get someone near her," she said. "Quietly. Don't approach her." Copy. The keynote session was scheduled for 2 p.m. Victoria had 40 minutes. She used them in a bathroom off the main corridor, standing at the sink with the water running cold over her wrists, a technique she had discovered years ago for managing the specific kind of adrenaline that accumulated when she had been running on no sleep and sustained pressure for extended periods. The cold water brought her back into her body, which was where she needed to be. Not in the presentation, not in the aftermath, not in any of the possible futures that branched out from the next 2 hours. Here, now. The sink, the water, the face in the mirror. The face in the mirror looked tired and precise and entirely clear-eyed. She dried her hands, straightened her jacket, and walked to the auditorium. The Hargrove Center's main auditorium seated 600. It was at capacity. She came in through the side entrance and took her assigned seat in the front section, reserved for summit presenters, and looked at the stage. A raised platform, clean lines, a single podium, and a presentation screen large enough to be visible from the back of the room. Alessandro was already in the front section, 15 feet to her left, flanked by Dante and Ven. He had seen her come in. He watched her sit down with an expression she read without difficulty. Controlled, still calculating, still operating on the assumption that whatever she was planning, he had a sufficient response prepared. He didn't know about Sorrel. He didn't know about the distribution list. He had found the drive, had contaminated the drive, and had concluded that her evidence base was compromised. He knew about Elena's disappearance and believed it had solved his witness problem. He had covered, he believed, the material exposure. What he had not covered was Victoria herself, who had spent 23 years, 12 inside his organization and the past 8 weeks outside it, developing the capacity to present complex financial structures from memory, without notes, without documents, without any external support that could be interfered with, because she had always understood, at a level below conscious articulation, that the most secure archive was the one that existed entirely inside her own mind. He had stolen 417 documents. He had not stolen the mind that produced them. The session chair called the afternoon keynote to order at 2:03 p.m. He introduced the first presenter, a fund manager from Geneva who spoke for 20 minutes about cross-border regulatory environments with the fluency of someone who had given this presentation many times and had stopped finding it interesting. The audience was polite and slightly restless, the specific restlessness of people waiting for the main event. Alessandro Romano was scheduled to present at 3 p.m. Victoria was scheduled at 2:55. The introduction came at 2:53. The session chair, who had been briefed by Adrian's team on her title and credentials but nothing else, said her name and her position and the topic of her presentation, which was listed in the program as Strategic Asset Architecture in the Modern Logistics Sector, a case study. She stood. She walked to the podium. She placed her leather portfolio on the surface, opened it, looked at the printed presentation inside, and then closed it. She looked out at the audience. 600 people. Investors, operators, mafia bosses who ran their organizations through layers of legitimate corporate structure, politicians whose relationship to this room was carefully deniable, press, whose credentials had been selectively approved. In the front section, Alessandro Romano, still, watching her with the expression of a man who had decided to let this play out because he believed he controlled the board. In the upper gallery, she could not see Elena Marsh but knew she was there. In a hotel conference room 2 blocks away, Patricia Sorrel had her hand on her keyboard. In the AV control room, Graves had 2 people she trusted. In her own chest, her heart was moving at a rate she acknowledged and set aside. She spoke without notes. 12 years ago, she said, a mid-sized criminal organization with legitimate holdings in 11 countries was on the verge of a structural collapse that would have ended it within 24 months. The collapse was internal. A combination of over-leveraged acquisitions, a tax structure with 3 critical vulnerabilities, and a merger strategy that was legally exposed in 2 jurisdictions. She paused. Most of you in this room know the organization I'm referring to. Most of you have done business with it. Some of you are currently considering a major commitment based on an acquisition strategy it announced this week. The room was very still. What most of you don't know, she said, is who prevented that collapse, and who has been preventing every subsequent crisis, building every significant strategic position, and designing every financial structure that organization has used to become what it is today. She looked at Alessandro. "The work was mine," she said. "I can prove it." She pressed the remote in her hand. The screen behind her came alive, not her prepared slides. The original files, projected directly from the cloud archive, authenticated, time-stamped, metadata visible in the top right corner of every document. Her name in the author field of 417 files. The earliest one dated 11 years and 9 months ago. The most recent dated 14 months ago, 6 weeks before the divorce. She heard the room absorb it. Not noise, the opposite of noise. The specific silence that descended when 600 intelligent people simultaneously updated their understanding of something they had believed they knew. "These are internal strategy documents from the Romano organization," she said. "The metadata is authenticated by an independent forensic firm whose report is being distributed to all relevant regulatory bodies and financial press as I speak." She paused. "I am the author of every significant financial strategy this organization has implemented for 12 years. My name was removed from the internal record by Marco Venn, Romano's head of financial operations, beginning 3 years ago. I have documentation of that removal. I have the original files and the altered versions." She kept her voice level. She had rehearsed this, not the words, but the register. The specific quality of controlled precision that communicated authority without performance, because performance invited the audience to evaluate the performer rather than the content, and the content was what mattered. In the front section, Alessandro had gone completely still. Dante had leaned toward him and said something she couldn't hear. Ben had his phone in his hand. "The acquisition strategy, Mr. Romano is scheduled to present this afternoon," she continued, "is built on a framework I developed 6 years ago for a potential acquisition that was not pursued at the time due to market conditions. The framework appears in my files dated March through August of that year. 41 paragraphs of Mr. Romano's presentation are verbatim reproductions of my original text, including 3 paragraphs I wrote in a specific idiosyncratic format that I used only in my private working documents." She pressed the remote again. Side by side. Her text. His text. The identical paragraphs. Paragraph by paragraph. The screen cycling through them at a pace that gave the audience time to read without giving them time to look away. "Beyond the question of intellectual ownership," she said, and here her voice shifted slightly, still controlled, but carrying something additional, something she had been building toward through 3 movements and was now delivering with the precision of a structural load distributed across exactly the right surface area. "There is a second issue that I believe requires immediate attention from every investor in this room who has been presented with the Romano acquisition as an investment opportunity." She pressed the remote. The shell structure. 3 layers of holding companies. The underlying accounts. The cycle of Alessandro's own capital through offshore structures, presented as independent institutional investment, used to manufacture the consensus that had convinced other investors to commit. The lead investor in the Romano acquisition, the institution providing 60% of the capital validation, is not an independent institution, she said. It is a series of entities ultimately controlled by Alessandro Romano himself. The investment commitment that every other investor has used as a signal of market validation is Mr. Romano's own money, presented through a structure designed to obscure its origin. The silence in the room had changed. It was not the silence of people processing information. It was the silence of people who had just understood that they were inside something that was about to have legal consequences, and who were calculating, simultaneously and rapidly, their own exposure. Alessandro stood up. "Stop." His voice cut across the room. Not loud. He was too controlled for loud, but carrying the voice of a man who had spent 20 years using it to make rooms obey. "This presentation is based on fabricated evidence and a personal vendetta. I will not, Mr. Romano." The session chair, to his credit, held his ground. You'll have the floor at 3 p.m. The documents she's showing were altered. The metadata was authenticated this morning by an independent forensic firm, Victoria said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Independently of the copy that was altered, the alteration of the drive I received from Elena Marsh is itself documented and attributable. She pressed the remote one final time. This is the forensic comparison between the compromised drive and the authenticated cloud archive. The alteration was made from an IP address registered to a shell company that traces, through 2 layers, to Marco Ven's personal holding entity. Ven stood up. The room erupted. Not shouting, the specific controlled chaos of 600 powerful people simultaneously managing their own reactions, pulling out phones, leaning toward each other, the sound of a room in which the architecture of a very large and long-standing deception had just publicly collapsed. Alessandro crossed the front section in 4 strides. Dante was moving. 2 of the security detail near the stage access point were moving. Victoria watched them come and did not step back from the podium, because stepping back would have communicated something to the room that she was not willing to communicate. Graves appeared from the left side of the stage, 2 of his people from the right. They did not touch Alessandro. There were 600 witnesses and a press section, and this was a place where physical confrontation carried costs that even Alessandro Romano could not absorb. They simply positioned themselves between him and the stage in a way that communicated, without any drama whatsoever, that the access point was closed. Alessandro stopped 8 feet from the stage. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. For a moment, 5 seconds, maybe 6, the room held itself in suspension around them, 600 people, and the weight of 12 years and the specific quality of a man looking at the woman he had discarded and understanding, for the first time and at a molecular level, what he had thrown away. You would burn everything, he said. His voice had changed. The controlled authority was still there, but something underneath it had cracked. Something that she recognized with a cold and distant clarity as the first genuine emotion she had seen from him in years. Everything we built. We didn't build it, she said. She said it quietly. Not for the room. The room had heard enough. For him. Because it was true and because it needed to be said directly, and because she was done with the 12 years of not saying it. I built it, she said. You stood in front of it. The room was absolutely silent. Then Adrian DeLuca, seated in the center section, stood up. He was not a man who made large gestures. He stood with the same quiet self-possession he brought to everything and looked around the room and said, in a voice that carried without effort, I'd like to formally introduce Victoria Bennett, Chief Strategy Officer of the DeLuca Group, effective today. He paused. And I'd like to suggest that any investor who received a commitment request from the Romano organization in the past 60 days contact their legal counsel before close of business. The room broke open. Press credentials appeared from the upper gallery. Phones came out across the entire room. The session chair was standing at his table looking at his program as though it might offer guidance on a situation it had not anticipated. Dante Ricci had his hand on Alessandro's arm and was saying something urgent and low that Alessandro was not responding to, because Alessandro was still looking at Victoria, and the look on his face was the most honest thing she had seen from him in 12 years. She stepped back from the podium. Her legs were steady. Her hands were steady. She was aware of the tremor she'd been managing for 31 hours and was aware that it was no longer there, which told her something about the relationship between sustained dread and its resolution. Sulin's voice in her ear, Sorel confirms, distribution complete, 17 regulatory bodies, 22 financial press outlets, 4 government agencies. A pause, and then, with a restraint that barely contained something else, it's done. Victoria walked off the stage. She came down the side steps and moved through the organized chaos of the front section. People on phones, people moving toward exits, people clustered in the specific configurations of those forming emergency alliances. And nobody stopped her, because the room was too busy processing what had just happened, and because she moved with the kind of deliberate calm that powerful people instinctively make space for. She was almost at the side corridor when a hand closed around her arm. Not rough, controlled. Alessandro. He had gotten past Graves. had moved through the crowd with the practiced skill of a man who had spent 20 years navigating hostile rooms, and was standing beside her with his hand on her arm, and Dante 3 steps behind, looking like he very much wished he were somewhere else. His face was close to hers. She could see the specific quality of what was happening behind his eyes. Not anger, not the performance of anger, but something raw and more disorganized, something she had never seen from him before. "You just destroyed 20 years, he said. "I documented 20 years, she said. "The destruction was already in progress. "You did that yourself." "Everything I built, Alessandro." She said his name the same way she always had, without inflection, without the specific hope she had once loaded into it. "Let go of my arm." His grip tightened for 1 second in which she felt the physical reality of 12 years compressed into a point of pressure on her forearm, and then released. She stepped back. "The legal exposure you're carrying right now is significant," she said. "You should call your attorney, not Richard Holt, someone who doesn't have a conflict, someone who can actually help you." She paused. "I'm not saying this to be kind. I'm saying it because it's accurate, and because I have spent 12 years giving you accurate information, and I don't see a reason to stop now." His face did something complicated. "Victoria." "We're done," she said, quietly. "We've been done. Tonight just made it legible." She turned and walked into the corridor. Behind her, she heard the sound of the room. 600 people and the weight of what had just happened, and the specific quality of a very large structure beginning from its foundations to come apart. She walked to the end of the corridor and stopped and stood with her back against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, breathing through it. Her phone buzzed. Adrian. Upper gallery, east side. She opened her eyes and went to find him. The upper gallery was quieter. The press had moved in force toward the exits and the main floor, chasing the story that was now detonating across every financial newswire and regulatory inbox simultaneously. Adrian was standing at the east railing with his hands in his pockets, looking down at the main floor where the controlled chaos was still organizing itself into something coherent. She stood beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Below, she could see Alessandro surrounded by Dante and 2 attorneys who had appeared from somewhere with the speed of people who had been standing by in anticipation of exactly this. Ven had disappeared entirely. 3 of the summit's organizing staff were in urgent conversation with the session chair. "Sorrell's team is already fielding calls," Adrian said. 4 regulators, 2 federal agencies. 3 of the major press outlets have the forensic package and are running verification. How long before the acquisition formally collapses? It's already collapsed. 3 of the committed investors have already retracted. The other 2 will follow before end of day. He paused. His legal exposure is significant. Yes. Another silence. Elena Marsh is with Graves, he said. She's all right. Victoria breathed. You didn't tell me she was going to be here today, he said. You didn't tell me you'd been watching her since she came to my office, she said. He accepted that. Below, she watched Alessandro Romano stand in the center of the room he had expected to own today and hold himself very still while the people around him managed the emergency with the specific efficiency of people who had been waiting for something to manage. He was still a commanding physical presence. He still held himself with the practiced authority of a man who had spent 20 years being feared. But something had gone out of it, some animating current that the authority had depended on. The certainty, she thought. The absolute bedrock certainty that he was the center of the structure, the source of the intelligence, the reason the empire existed. That certainty was gone. She had taken it from him in 11 minutes from a podium, and it would not come back because certainty of that kind was not renewable once the evidence against it had been made public and permanent and distributed to 17 regulatory bodies and 22 financial press outlets. She had built his empire. She had just documented its foundation. And now, for the first time in 20 years, Alessandro Romano was standing in a room without the architecture that had always invisibly held him up. And the look on his face from the upper gallery was the look of a man discovering at the worst possible moment that the ground beneath him had always been someone else's. Her phone buzzed again. Not Adrian, not Su Lin. A number she recognized after a moment. Patricia Sorrell. She answered. The Romano organization's primary bank just froze discretionary accounts pending regulatory review, Sorel said. It happened 11 minutes ago, before your presentation ended. A pause. Someone inside his organization triggered a compliance flag preemptively, before the public exposure. Victoria processed that. Who? She asked. We don't know yet. Sorel paused. But whoever it was had access to internal financial controls and chose this morning to use them. Another pause. Ms. Bennett, someone inside the Romano organization helped you today, and they did it without telling you. Victoria looked down at the main floor, at Alessandro, still surrounded by attorneys, at Dante Ricci, standing slightly apart from the group, his phone at his side, not making calls, not managing, just standing, which was not what Dante did in a crisis. She looked at Dante for a long moment. He looked up. Their eyes met across the height of the gallery and the width of the auditorium and the 12 years of everything that had happened inside the organization they had both served. Dante looked back down, and Victoria understood, with a sudden and complete clarity that felt like the last piece of a structure finding its place, that the architecture of what had just happened was more complex than she had built it, had been supported from a direction she hadn't anticipated, and that the full truth of this day was not yet finished arriving. Her heart was doing something loud and irregular behind her ribs. She looked at Adrian. Something's still moving, she said. He turned from the railing to look at her. The compliance flag on his accounts, she said. Someone inside his organization triggered it this morning, before the presentation. Adrian's expression shifted, a fraction, barely visible, but she had learned to read fractions. Did you know about that? She asked. He held her gaze. Adrian, there are things still in motion, he said carefully, that I think you need to see before I explain them. She looked at him for a long moment. 12 years of having things kept from her. 8 weeks of operating on incomplete information in a room that turned out to be larger and more populated than she'd known. And now this, a door she hadn't known existed, standing open at the exact moment she believed she had finally seen the whole board. Show me, she said. And the look on Adrian DeLuca's face as he turned from the railing and moved toward the east corridor was not the expression of a man who had orchestrated everything. It was the expression of a man who had just watched something exceed every calculation he'd made, and who was moving toward whatever came next with the specific quality of someone who understood, perhaps for the first time, that the woman walking beside him was operating at a level he had not fully prepared for, which meant the thing waiting in the east corridor was either the last piece of a structure finally complete or the first piece of something neither of them had planned. And Victoria Bennett, who had not slept in 34 hours, and whose hands were finally completely steady, walked toward it without hesitation. The east corridor was empty. Adrian walked ahead of her, unhurried, the same measured pace she had observed across 8 weeks of proximity. The walk of a man who had learned long ago that urgency communicated vulnerability, and who had structured every external behavior around the prevention of that signal. She matched his pace and said nothing. The sounds of the auditorium diminished behind them, absorbed by the corridor's length and the building's engineered acoustics, until by the time they reached the east elevator bank, the noise had reduced itself to a low frequency. She felt more in her chest than her ears. Adrian pressed the elevator call button. 12, he said. Not to her, to the space. The elevator opened. They rode up in silence. She watched the floor numbers and kept her breathing even, and thought about Dante Ricci's face. The specific quality of the look he had given her across the auditorium, the way he had looked back down. Not the look of a man caught in something. The look of a man who had completed something. The 12th floor of the Hargrove Center was a suite of private conference rooms used for closed negotiations, the kind of meetings that didn't appear on any official summit schedule and whose participants arrived and departed through separate access points. Adrian led her to the third door on the left and opened it without knocking. Dante Ricci was sitting at the table, alone. No phone on the table, no documents. His jacket was off, folded over the back of the chair beside him, and he was sitting with his hands flat on the table surface in the posture of a man who had decided some time ago that he was done managing his own appearance. Victoria stopped in the doorway. She looked at Dante for a long moment. At the 12 years of him, the specific architecture of his function inside the Romano organization, the man who had handed her a list of items to surrender in the Meridian Grand Lobby 8 weeks ago and had done it with what she had identified, even then, as genuine discomfort. "Sit down, Victoria," Dante said. His voice was different. Not the consigliere's voice, the managed instrument of Alessandro's organizational authority. Something older and more tired. She sat. Adrian closed the door and remained standing near it, which told her something about how he understood this moment. Not his to own, just his to contain. "The compliance flag," she said. "Yes," Dante said. "You triggered it." He looked at her steadily. "I've been building the case for 11 months, he said. "The shell structure, the securities exposure, the document reclassification. I had most of it before you walked into this building 8 weeks ago." He paused. "I didn't have the intellectual property documentation. I knew it existed. I was in the room when Venn ordered the reclassification, but I didn't know you had kept copies." She held his gaze. "Why?" It was a short question carrying a long question inside it, and Dante understood both. "Because I've known Alessandro Romano for 26 years, he said. "I came up with him. I built half of what he built, and I watched him become something I didn't recognize, slowly enough that by the time I understood what I was watching, I was already inside it." He looked at his hands on the table. "I watched what he did to you, not just at the Meridian Grand. Over years, I watched him take your work and let it be stripped of your name and receive the credit for it. And I told myself it was the structure of the organization, the way things operated, the necessary architecture of his authority." A pause, and his voice went quieter. "I told myself that for a long time." "What changed?" she asked. "He filed the summit presentation," Dante said. "I read it. I recognized your language, not because I'd read your original files, but because I had been in rooms for 12 years where Alessandro explained strategy he didn't fully understand in language that was slightly too precise for him, and I had learned to hear that gap." He looked up. "When I read the presentation and heard your voice coming through his words, I understood that it was never going to stop, that the next version of you, whoever came after you, would have the same thing done to them, that it was structural, that Alessandro had built a machine for consuming other people's intelligence, and he would keep feeding it as long as the machine ran." The room was very quiet. "I went to Adrian 8 months ago," Dante said. Victoria looked at Adrian. "He came to me with documentation of the shell structure," Adrian said. "Financial records. I had independent information about the shell from my own source, but not the full construction. Together they were sufficient." He paused. "Dante didn't know about you and me, didn't know about Geneva, didn't know I'd been watching your work. That convergence was coincidence," Victoria said. "Parallel construction," Adrian said. "Two separate approaches to the same problem arriving at the same point." She sat with that. 12 years of her life, reduced and then rebuilt, and now this. The discovery that the architecture of her survival had been supported, from a direction she hadn't seen, by a man she had understood as part of the machinery that had consumed her. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked Dante. "When I came in, when I started at Crestline, you could have—" "I didn't know if you'd want it," he said. "What I had. I didn't know if you wanted to win this way, with an ally inside his organization, or on your own terms." He paused. "You've always been particular about your own terms." She looked at him for a long time. "The compliance flag this morning," she said. "That was irreversible." "Yes." "You've ended your relationship with him." "I ended it 11 months ago," Dante said. "This morning I just made it legible." He used her word, the word she had used to Alessandro in the corridor below an hour ago. She recognized it and understood it had not been accidental. "He'll know it was you," she said. "He already knows." Dante's expression didn't change. "He called me 20 minutes ago. I didn't answer." He paused. "I won't answer." She looked at the table, at her own hands on its surface, at the specific quality of this room, the 12th floor, the closed door, The three of them inside a moment that was the resolution of something that had been building across 12 years and 11 months and 8 weeks and 34 sleepless hours. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Dante reached into his jacket and placed a drive on the table. 11 months of documentation, he said. Financial records, communication logs, decision trails. Everything I built before you came in. He pushed it toward her. "It's yours. Do with it what you need to." She looked at the drive. She didn't pick it up immediately. "Dante," she said, "the night at the Meridian Grand, the phone, the cards, the ring." She paused. "That was you managing the logistics." "Yes." "Did you know what he was going to do beforehand?" A silence that lasted long enough to be its own answer. "I knew he was planning a public announcement," Dante said carefully. "I didn't know the specific form until that afternoon." He held her gaze. "If I had known the full shape of it earlier—" He stopped. Started again. "I'm not going to tell you I would have stopped it. I don't know if I would have. What I know is that I stood in that lobby and I asked you for your ring, and I have not stopped thinking about that moment since." She picked up the drive. She turned it over in her hand once and then placed it in the inside pocket of her jacket, beside the folded note from Elena Marsh that she had been carrying for 9 days. "I need you to give a formal statement to Sorrel's team," she said. "Today. While everything is still moving." "I know." He stood and picked up his jacket. "I have her number. I called her this morning before the flag." He paused at her expression. "I've been coordinating with her for 3 weeks." She stared at him. "Patricia Sorrel reached out to me," he said, "through an intermediary. She had your forensic package and she needed internal corroboration for the shell structure documentation. I provided it." He paused. "She didn't tell you." "She didn't tell me," Victoria said. "I asked her not to." He looked at her directly. "Because I needed you to walk onto that stage today without knowing how much of the floor was already built under you. Because if you had known, if you had felt the net, you might have held something back. You might have been careful." His jaw tightened slightly. "And I needed you to not be careful. I needed you to say all of it." The room held that. She breathed through it. "You needed me angry," she said. "I needed you complete," he said. "There's a difference." He put on his jacket, straightened it with the precise habit of 26 years of presenting himself in rooms that required precision, and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and didn't turn around. "For what it's worth," he said, "everyone who worked closely with you knew. The analysts, the junior strategists, the people who sat in the rooms where the work actually happened." He paused. "We always knew whose voice it was." He walked out. She sat for a moment in the empty room. Adrian stayed near the door, giving her the silence, which she appreciated with a specificity she couldn't have articulated. "How much of this did you design?" she asked. "The Crestline opportunity? Bringing you in." He was honest in a way that cost something. "The summit positioning. Those were mine." A pause. "Dante's involvement, Sorrel's coordination with him, the compliance flag this morning. Those happened outside what I designed. The board turned out to be larger than I built it." She looked at him. "What did you think was going to happen today?" she asked. "I thought you were going to expose the intellectual theft and damage his credibility sufficiently to collapse the acquisition." He paused. "I didn't anticipate the shell structure. I didn't anticipate the level of documentation you had accumulated. I didn't anticipate—" He stopped. "What?" "The way you closed the presentation file," he said. "On the podium. You looked at it and you closed it, and then you spoke for 11 minutes without a single note." He paused. "I didn't anticipate that." She remembered the moment, the weight of the portfolio, the choice to close it, the specific quality of clarity that arrived when she made that decision. The understanding that the most powerful thing she could bring into that room was not documentation, but herself, unmediated, saying what was true in her own voice without any architecture between her and the audience. "I've been making cases from notes my entire career," she said. "Someone else's notes, someone else's meeting room, someone else's name on the door." She paused. "I wanted to do it once without any of that." Adrian nodded slowly. "Come on," he said. "There are things that need handling." The afternoon was a long sequence of necessary actions. Patricia Sorrell arrived at the Hargrove Center at 4 p.m. and set up in one of the 12th floor conference rooms with 3 associates and the complete documentation package and began the process of coordinating with the regulatory and legal contacts who were by then calling at a rate that required a dedicated intake system. Victoria sat in on the first 2 hours of this, providing clarification where the documentation required context, and then handed off to Sorrell's team and stepped back. Dante gave his statement at 5:30. She was not in the room. She had asked not to be because his statement needed to be his, uninfluenced by her presence, and because she had spent 8 weeks learning to trust her own judgment about which rooms she needed to be in and which ones worked better without her. Elena Marsh came to the 12th floor at 6 p.m., escorted by one of Graves's people. She had cleaned up since the auditorium. The bruise on her cheekbone was less visible under the light, but she was moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body was carrying more than it was showing. She sat down across from Victoria in a small room off the main corridor and looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had paid a significant price and was accounting for it in real time. "Are you all right?" Victoria asked. "I've been better," Elena said. "I've also been worse." She looked at the table. "They had me for 4 days, in a house somewhere north of the city. I don't know exactly where. 2 people, rotating. They didn't hurt me beyond—" She touched her cheekbone briefly. "The first day, when I wouldn't confirm where the backups were stored." She paused. "I didn't tell them." "I know," Victoria said. "They figured out the attorney's office on their own. The compliance firm was real. They had a compliance firm call him. I didn't tell them that either." She looked up. "How did you get the backup?" "Verbal authorization, recorded." Victoria paused. "You called me from the lobby the night you came. I record all incoming calls as a matter of practice." Elena looked at her. Something moved across her face, relief maybe, or the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding a weight and has just set it down. "I want to give a statement," Elena said, "on record, to the regulatory team. Sorrell's people are on the 4th floor. I know. I wanted to tell you first." She paused. "I wanted to tell you that I'm not doing this because I think it will help me professionally, or because I expect anything from it. I'm doing it because—" She stopped, looked for the right framing, and seemed to decide against all of them. "Because it's accurate," she said finally, "and because accurate things should be on record." Victoria looked at her across the table. "Thank you," she said, "for coming to me, in the first place." Elena nodded once, stood, and left. The light in the corridor had changed, had taken on the specific quality of late afternoon pushing toward evening, the quality that makes cities look briefly honest, all the surfaces catching the low angle at once. Victoria stood at the corridor window for a moment and looked out at the financial district in its end-of-day motion. The specific choreography of people and vehicles and the ordinary machinery of a city that had no idea what had happened in the auditorium 3 floors below and wouldn't, most of it, until the morning papers. Her phone rang. "Alessandro." She looked at it for 2 full rings. She answered. "I need to meet with you," he said. His voice had changed again since the auditorium, had shed the last residue of the controlled authority and arrived at something she hadn't heard from him before, something unguarded. "Tonight, not attorneys, not advisors, just, I need to talk to you. Alessandro, please." The words sat in the air between them with an unfamiliar weight. She had heard him say many things over 12 years. She had never heard him say please and mean it as precisely as he meant it now. She looked out the window at the city. "Tomorrow morning," she said, 10 o'clock. "The Aldine Hotel." She paused. 1 hour. She hung up. She found Adrian in the main conference room reviewing documents with Sorrell's team, and she stood in the doorway and waited, and he looked up and registered her expression and excused himself and came into the corridor. "He called," she said. "I expected he would." "I agreed to meet him tomorrow." Adrian looked at her for a moment. She watched him consider the things she knew he was considering. The strategic implications, the legal exposure, the risk of the meeting from multiple angles. And then she watched him decide not to say any of those things. "All right," he said. I need to know something first, she said. Before tomorrow. Before any of that. He waited. The ownership documents, she said. The companies and properties from the divorce. The assets I lost. She held his gaze. Dante mentioned in his documentation one reference, a single line, to a series of legitimate transactions that had been conducted in the past several months, acquiring assets previously held under Romano family structures. She paused. That was you. Adrian did not look away. Some of those assets had strategic value to the DeLuca group, he said carefully. Some of them, she said. Not all. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Not all. She looked at him. Why? She asked. It was the same short question with the long question inside it that she had asked Dante, and Adrian understood it the same way. Understood that she was not asking about the mechanics, but about the motivation, the thing that had driven a decision that had no strategic logic, that could not be explained by the architecture of what he had designed. Because they were yours, he said simply. She stood in the corridor of the 12th floor of the Hargrove Center and looked at Adrian DeLuca and felt something move through her that was not gratitude. Gratitude was too small for it. And was not love, not yet, not in the specific way that word was eventually going to apply, but was something preceding both of those things, something that had to do with being seen accurately by another person for the first time in a very long time, and the specific quality of that experience after years of deliberate invisibility. She breathed through it. How much? She asked. He told her. She closed her eyes for a moment. The purchase price on the final document, he told her, had been structured at cost across the individual acquisitions, consolidated into a single transfer value for the formal handover. It was the number from the drugstore, the number from the plastic chair, the exact amount she had carried out of the Meridian Grand 8 weeks ago, with her coat and her notepad and the specific kind of silence that falls over a person when the worst thing they were quietly preparing for finally arrives. $2,000. The day you walked away, he said quietly, they thought they had reduced your life to $2,000. She opened her eyes. Today, he said, that same $2,000 buys back everything that should have been yours. The corridor was very still. Outside the window, the city was doing its ordinary evening things. Lights coming on in office towers, traffic shifting from the geometry of business hours to the looser pattern of people going home. Ordinary. Continuous. The city that had watched her walk out of the Meridian Grand 8 weeks ago without any awareness of what it was watching, and that was watching nothing now, its back turned, attending to its own business. She signed the documents 40 minutes later, in the main conference room with Sorrell's associate as witness, and Adrian across the table, and the specific feeling of a pen in her hand completing something that she had not known 8 weeks ago was possible to complete. When it was done, she sat for a moment and looked at the signed page. She had signed divorce papers in a ballroom in front of 300 people. She had signed an authorization of the Veritas acquisition in a conference room while running on 3 hours of sleep. She had signed her name at the bottom of 417 internal documents that had then had her name removed. This signature was different. This one stayed. The meeting with Alessandro was at 10 a.m. in the Aldine Hotel. She arrived at 9:55 and sat in the lobby with a coffee she didn't drink and watched the door. He came in at 10:02, alone, no Dante, no security detail, which was the first time she had seen him enter a space without protection in 12 years. He was wearing a dark coat over a simple suit, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept, which was something they now had in common. He sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The accounts are frozen, he said. The acquisition is finished. 3 of my primary partners have initiated formal reviews of their relationships with the organization. He said it without emotion, as inventory. The legal exposure is... Sorrell's team is thorough. Your documentation is thorough. He paused. You were always thorough. Yes, she said. He looked at his hands for a moment. I want to offer you something, he said. Not as legal negotiation. My attorneys are handling that separately. This is... He stopped, found the word. Personal. She waited. He placed a folder on the table between them. She opened it. Inside were documents she recognized. Not copies, not reconstructions, but originals. Organizational records from the first 3 years of the Romano enterprise. Her signature on strategic documents from before the reclassification, before Venn had begun his systematic erasure. Records Alessandro had retained personally, she understood, separate from the organizational archive. Records he had always had. I kept them, he said. Her expression asked the question. From the beginning, before any of the reclassification, these are the originals, your signature, your name, your work. He paused. I kept them because... He stopped again, and the stopping was different this time, was not the practiced pause of a man managing a room, but the genuine cessation of a man who had arrived at something he did not have prepared language for. Because I knew. I always knew whose work it was. The lobby was quiet around them. Morning light came through the east windows in long, flat planes across the carpet. "And you let it happen anyway," she said. "Yes." The word was very simple and very complete and contained inside it 12 years of everything she had named and not named and understood and refused to understand about the man sitting across from her. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "Because I was afraid," he said, "of what it meant. If your name was on it, if the world knew it was yours, then what was I?" He held her gaze. "I built an empire. I believed that. I needed to believe it. And you let me believe it because that was the role you had accepted. And because..." He paused. "Because you loved me. For a long time you loved me." She did not deny it. "And I took that," he said. "I took it, and I built with it. And I told myself you were protected, that the arrangement benefited you, that the invisibility was something you chose." His voice had gone quieter. "I was lying to myself. I knew it then. I know it now." She looked at the folder. "I'm not asking you to come back," he said. "I'm not offering that. My attorneys, we're working through the legal exposure, the regulatory issues. The organization it's significantly damaged." He paused. "I'm asking you to take these, the originals, because they belong to you." He paused once more. "And because I owe you something that I cannot actually pay, and this is the closest I can come." She looked at him across the table. At 51 years old and a sleepless night, and the specific quality of a man who had arrived, too late and at great cost, at an honest accounting of himself. She had imagined this moment, not this specific form of it, but something like it, in various configurations over the past 8 weeks, and in most of those configurations she had known exactly what to say. She didn't know what to say. What she knew was simpler and more final than anything that could be said. She picked up the folder. She held it for a moment with both hands, feeling the weight of the original documents inside it, the specific texture of paper that had been handled and filed and retained for 12 years by a man who had known all along what he was holding. "All right," she said. He nodded. She stood. He looked up at her from the chair with an expression she had spent 12 years trying to read accurately and was reading now, without difficulty for the first time. Not because it had changed, but because she had changed, had become someone who no longer needed it to mean anything other than what it was. "Victoria." He said her name. Just her name. "Goodbye, Alessandro," she said. She walked out of the Aldine Hotel into the morning, which was cold and clear and tasted of distant rain, and she stood on the pavement for a moment with the folder under her arm and the city doing its ordinary business all around her and the specific quality of a weight that had been present so long she had stopped noticing it, shifting. Not gone. Not immediately. Weights like that didn't go in a morning. But different. Changed in some fundamental way that she would spend a long time understanding. She walked. 3 weeks later, in a conference room in the DeLuca Group's converted warehouse building, Adrian placed a single document on the table in front of her. The ownership transfer for the recovered assets, fully processed, fully clear, registered in her name alone. Beside it, he placed a second document, her formal appointment as Chief Strategy Officer of the DeLuca Group, with the full scope of the role and the organizational authority that went with it, negotiated across the previous 2 weeks by Sorrell's team and Adrian's attorneys with the specific care of people who understood that this arrangement needed to be structurally sound from its foundation. She read both documents. She signed both. Su Lin was in the room, which she had requested. Elena Marsh was in this building. employed as of the previous week as a senior analyst on Victoria's team, which had been Victoria's first official act in the new role. Graves was in the corridor outside, which was simply what Graves did. When the signing was complete, Adrian gathered the documents and handed them to the attorney present and looked at Victoria across the table with the expression she had been learning to read over the course of 8 weeks. The structural engineer, the load-bearing points, but with something additional now, something that had been accruing across 8 weeks of watching her operate, that had no architectural name. He placed a single additional item on the table, a folder. Thin, 5 pages. She opened it. The first page was a project overview, a new acquisition strategy, the next phase of the DeLuca Group's international expansion, comprehensive and elegant. The kind of structure she could see immediately was built on sound foundations. The second page was a note, handwritten, which was not something she had ever seen from him before. It said, "The strategy is mine. The execution requires someone better at it than I am. The question is whether you want to build the next chapter here." She read it twice. She looked up. He was watching her with the particular quality of attention he brought to everything, total, without performance, without the anxiety that most people carried in moments of genuine exposure. He had put something on the table that had nothing to do with strategy or structure or the architecture of power, and he was sitting across from it without visible discomfort, which was, she had come to understand, one of the most specific things about him. She closed the folder. She placed her hand on the table, not on the folder, not reaching, simply present, the gesture of someone who has arrived somewhere and recognized it. He placed his hand beside hers, not on it, beside it. The same gesture, the same quality, present, not grasping. She looked at their hands side by side on the table, and then she looked at him and said, "Ask me properly." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "Would you build the next chapter with me?" he said. She thought about the plastic chair in the drugstore, the notepad, the $2,000 and the coat and the October air and the specific quality of the city at midnight when you have lost everything and are standing in it alone, making a promise that feels, in the moment, less like hope than like the last available structure. She thought about 417 documents with her name removed, about Elena's bruised cheekbone, about Dante's hands flat on the conference table, about the original records in the folder Alessandro had placed between them in the hotel lobby, the documents he had kept for 12 years while letting her name be erased from everything else, the specific and irreducible evidence that knowledge of what was real does not always translate into the courage to say it. She thought about the presentation, the moment she had closed the portfolio on the podium and looked out at 600 people and said what was true in her own voice without any architecture between herself and the audience. She thought about all of it. Then she looked at Adrian DeLuca and made a decision that was entirely hers. Not made from need, not made from the pressure of diminished options, not made from the specific exhaustion of a woman who has run out of alternatives. Made from the clear-eyed recognition of a person who has arrived, after considerable cost and considerable distance, at a place that is genuinely worth choosing. "Yes," she said. The room was quiet. Outside, the city went on. Indifferent, continuous, the ordinary machinery of 10 million people doing 10 million ordinary things in the October morning. Su Lin moved something on the table behind them. The attorney gathered the signed documents with the careful precision of someone who understood the weight of what they held. Victoria looked at her name on the ownership transfer one last time before the attorney closed the folder. Her name, fully present, in the author field where it had always belonged. She did not cry. She simply sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with something true that has been absent for a long time and has finally come back. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the quiet insistence of all true things, which do not announce themselves but simply remain patient and permanent, waiting for the moment when the room is finally ready to receive them. The woman Alessandro Romano had believed he could reduce to $2,000 and a coat and a walk across a hotel lobby, sat in a conference room in a converted warehouse on a Thursday morning in October, and looked at her own name and felt, for the first time in 12 years, the specific weight of it. Not a burden, an anchor. Hers.